December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At 5:30 a.m., the darkness exploded with light and thunder. Over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, shattering the winter silence that had settled over what Allied commanders considered a quiet sector. American soldiers, many of them green replacements who had arrived just weeks earlier, were awakened not by reveille, but by the earth-shattering roar of the largest German offensive operation of the entire Western Front campaign. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. For the American soldiers caught in this maelstrom, the next 6 weeks would test human endurance beyond anything they had imagined. They would face not just the Wehrmacht's finest remaining divisions, but also the brutal Belgian winter, where temperatures plunged to 0 degrees Fahrenheit and snow drifts reached waist-high. What unfolded in the Ardennes was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. Over 600,000 American soldiers would be committed to the fight. Nearly 20,000 would die. Tens of thousands more would be wounded or captured. But through their sacrifice, determination, and incredible resilience, they would turn Hitler's last offensive into Germany's final defeat in the West. This is the story of how American soldiers survived the frozen hell of the Ardennes, a story of desperate last stands, impossible odds, and ordinary men performing extraordinary acts of courage when everything seemed lost. In early December 1944, the mood among Allied commanders was cautiously optimistic. The liberation of France had been completed. The port of Antwerp was operational. Allied armies were pressed against Germany's western border, preparing for the final push into the Reich. Victory seemed inevitable, just a matter of time. The Ardennes Forest sector, stretching across eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered the quietest part of the entire Western Front. This 80-mile stretch of densely forested, hilly terrain was held by only 4 American divisions, 2 of them new to combat, 2 of them exhausted from recent fighting and sent to the Ardennes to rest and refit. The sector was so quiet that it had earned the nickname the Ghost Front. Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps held this line with approximately 68,000 men spread impossibly thin. Some companies were responsible for frontages that should have been held by entire battalions. But nobody was particularly worried. The German army was clearly beaten, retreating everywhere. The Ardennes, with its poor road network and difficult terrain, seemed the last place the Germans would choose to attack. What Allied intelligence failed to detect was one of the most successful deception operations of the entire war. While attention focused on German defenses along the Siegfried Line, Hitler had secretly assembled his last strategic reserve for one final, desperate offensive. 3 entire armies, over 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and assault guns, were moving into attack positions opposite the thinly held American line. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was audacious to the point of madness. German forces would punch through the weak American line, race northwest through Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and capture Antwerp in 7 days. This would split the Allied armies, trap British and Canadian forces in the north, and potentially force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, allowing Hitler to concentrate all resources against the Soviets in the east. The offensive would be led by the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army in the center under General Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army in the south under General Erich Brandenberger. These were not the depleted, demoralized units that had been retreating across France. Hitler had scraped together his best remaining formations, many of them rebuilt SS Panzer divisions with experienced cadres and new equipment. On the American side, the units holding the line had no idea what was coming. The 99th Infantry Division, having arrived in Europe just weeks earlier, was experiencing its first taste of frontline duty. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for only 5 days, replacing the veteran 2nd Infantry Division. The 28th Infantry Division, badly mauled in the Ardennes Forest fighting, was supposed to be resting. The 4th Infantry Division, also exhausted from the Ardennes Forest, held the southern shoulder. Staff Sergeant Bruce Egger of the 424th Infantry Regiment, 106th Division, later recalled the nights before the attack. It was cold, miserable, but quiet. We'd hear Germans singing Christmas carols across the lines some nights. There was almost a strange peacefulness to it. Some of the guys joked that maybe the war really was almost over. We had no idea that across from us entire panzer divisions were forming up in the darkness. The American soldiers manning foxholes and outposts in the Ardennes that December were typical of the U.S. Army in late 1944. A mix of draftees and volunteers, farm boys and city kids, many barely out of their teens. They came from every state, every background, unified by the green uniform and the determination to finish the job and go home. Within hours, they would be fighting for their lives. At precisely 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the German artillery barrage began. For 90 minutes, shells rained down on American positions along the entire front. For the green troops of the 99th and 106th Divisions, who had never experienced combat, it was a terrifying introduction to war. Foxholes collapsed, communication wires were severed, command posts were hit, and in the darkness and confusion, officers struggled to determine what was happening. Private First Class William James of the 423rd Infantry Regiment, 106th Division, remembered. The whole world seemed to explode. Trees burst apart from airbursts. The ground shook continuously. We couldn't hear anything but explosions. When it finally stopped, my ears were ringing so bad I couldn't hear my sergeant shouting orders from 5 feet away. As dawn broke over the snow-covered forest, German infantry emerged from the tree line, thousands of them in winter camouflage advancing in waves. Behind them came the tanks, the feared Panthers and Tigers, along with assault guns and self-propelled artillery. The scale of the attack was immediately apparent. This was no local counterattack. This was a full-scale offensive. In the northern sector, Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army slammed into the positions held by the 99th Infantry Division and elements of the 2nd Infantry Division. The plan called for rapid breakthrough and exploitation, but here the Germans encountered unexpected resistance. Despite being green troops, the men of the 99th fought with desperate determination. At the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath, American soldiers discovered that their stubbornness could delay even elite SS Panzer divisions. Tank destroyers from the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion dug in at crossroads and behind buildings, knocked out German tanks at point-blank range. When their positions became untenable, they would fall back to the next prepared position and do it again. Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Northrup, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 395th Infantry Regiment, held a critical position on Elsenborn Ridge, the high ground dominating the northern approach routes. His orders were simple: hold at all costs. For 3 days, against overwhelming odds, his battalion did exactly that. They stopped the 12th SS Panzer Division cold, preventing Dietrich's army from reaching the Meuse River roads. Staff Sergeant Richard Byers, a squad leader in Company K, later described the fighting. They came at us in waves. We'd mow down one group, and another would appear. Our machine guns were firing so much they were heating the snow around them into steam. We were running low on ammunition, passing out what we had from the wounded and the dead. But we held that hill. We held it because there was nowhere else to go. The defense of Elsenborn Ridge was crucial. By denying the Germans this high ground and the road network beyond it, the northernmost German thrust was effectively stopped in its tracks within the first 3 days. Dietrich's powerful Panzer Army, which was supposed to lead the race to Antwerp, was stalled and would never recover its momentum. But in the center, Monteufel's 5th Panzer Army was having more success. His troops smashed into the positions held by the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division along the Schnee-Eifel, a heavily wooded ridge running north to south. Through a combination of surprise, overwhelming force, and tactical skill, German units penetrated deep into American lines, surrounding entire regiments. Within 48 hours, 2 entire regiments of the 106th Division, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments, totaling over 8,000 men, were cut off on the Schnee Eifel. Cut off from supplies, outnumbered, and with their ammunition running low, these units fought on for 3 days before being forced to surrender on December 19th. It was the largest surrender of American forces in the European theater. Private Henry Shapiro, one of the few who escaped the encirclement, later recalled, "We could hear the fighting all around us. We knew other units were trying to break through to us, but the Germans had us surrounded. Officers tried to organize a breakout, but we were low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies. When the order finally came to surrender, some men cried. We'd fought as hard as we could." The loss of these 2 regiments was a catastrophe, but the sacrifice of the 106th Division was not in vain. By forcing the Germans to spend 3 days reducing the Schnee Eifel pocket instead of racing west, they bought precious time for American forces to organize a defense in depth. As German spearheads penetrated deeper into the Ardennes, one location became critical to both sides: the town of Bastogne. This small Belgian market town sat at the center of a crucial road network. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne, roads that the German panzers desperately needed to maintain their advance. Without Bastogne, the German offensive would bog down in the narrow, muddy tracks of the Ardennes Forest. Major General Troy Middleton, the Fate Corps commander, recognized Bastogne's importance immediately. On December 17th, with German forces already breaking through on multiple sectors, he made a critical decision. He ordered the 101st Airborne Division, which was resting near Reims, France after hard fighting in Holland, to move immediately to Bastogne and hold it. The 101st, the famed Screaming Eagles, was an elite unit, but they were light infantry paratroopers without the heavy weapons and armor needed for sustained defensive fighting. Moreover, their commanding general, Maxwell Taylor, was in the United States. Command fell to the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artilleryman who would become one of the battle's most legendary figures. The race to Bastogne was on. The 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, moved north in a convoy of trucks on December 18th. They had limited ammunition, no winter clothing, they'd left it behind in their haste, and little information about what they were facing. What they had was determination and the knowledge that American soldiers were fighting and dying while they raced to help. The paratroopers arrived in Bastogne on the evening of December 18th and immediately began setting up a perimeter defense around the town. Within hours, the first German probing attacks began. By December 20th, Bastogne was completely surrounded. German forces, having bypassed the town to continue their advance, left blocking forces to contain the defenders while the main effort pushed west. But here, German planning ran into American stubbornness. McAuliffe and his 11,000 defenders, along with elements of other units that had fallen back into the perimeter, decided they would hold Bastogne regardless of being surrounded. They had artillery, they had determined soldiers, and they had no intention of surrendering. The siege of Bastogne would become the most famous action of the entire Battle of the Bulge. For 7 days, from December 20th to December 26th, the defenders held against repeated German attacks, artillery bombardment, and air attacks. The weather was brutal, with temperatures dropping below zero and snow falling constantly. Men huddled in frozen foxholes, their weapons freezing, their water canteens turning to ice. Private First Class Robert Bowen of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment described the conditions. "We were freezing, literally freezing. Guys would huddle together in foxholes just to share body heat. We'd wrap our rifles in whatever cloth we could find to keep them from freezing. The wounded were the worst off. We didn't have enough medical supplies, and with the cold, even minor wounds could become deadly. Food was rationed severely. Ammunition was carefully husbanded. Medical supplies ran dangerously low. The defenders knew that relief was coming, that Patton's Third Army was fighting its way north to break the siege, but the question was whether they could hold out long enough. On December 22nd, the Germans sent a delegation under a flag of truce with an ultimatum: surrender or face annihilation. The German message noted the hopelessness of the American position and promised honorable treatment as prisoners of war. The ultimatum was presented to General McAuliffe. McAuliffe's response would become legendary. After reading the German ultimatum, he responded with a single word: nuts. When the German officers expressed confusion at this American slang, the message was clarified: go to hell. This defiant response, when it became known, electrified not just the defenders of Bastogne, but Americans everywhere. It became a symbol of American determination and fighting spirit. The defenders of Bastogne were not alone in their suffering. All across the Bulge that German forces had driven into Allied lines, American soldiers were fighting isolated actions, holding critical crossroads, and conducting desperate delaying actions. While Bastogne garnered headlines, another town was the scene of equally critical fighting: St. Vith. This road junction town, held by remnants of the 106th Division, elements of the 7th Armored Division, and various other units scraped together from the chaos, became a thorn in the German advance. Brigadier General Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, organized a defense of St. Vith that would hold for 6 crucial days. From December 16th through December 21st, this ad hoc force of perhaps 15,000 men held against attacks by elements of 4 German divisions, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. The fighting in St. Vith was close quarters, brutal combat. American tank destroyers stalked German tanks through the streets. Artillery observers called fire on their own positions as German infantry overran them. Engineers fought as infantry. Headquarters personnel grabbed rifles and manned the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel William Fuller, commanding the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion, described the confusion. We had units from a dozen different commands. Nobody knew who was in charge of what. Communication was almost impossible, but everyone knew one thing: we had to hold St. Vith as long as possible. Every hour we held was another hour for defenses to form up behind us. The defenders of St. Vith finally received orders to withdraw on December 21st, having accomplished their mission. The 6-day delay they imposed on German forces, particularly on the 5th Panzer Army's advance, was crucial. Roads that should have been open for German exploitation remained blocked. Timetables that called for the Meuse to be reached by December 18th were hopelessly behind schedule. When the defenders finally withdrew from St. Vith, they did so in an organized fighting retreat, taking their wounded and destroying what equipment couldn't be saved. They had bought time with blood, but that time would prove invaluable. Not all the stories from the Battle of the Bulge were of heroic resistance and ultimate victory. On December 17th, one of the war's worst atrocities occurred near the crossroads at Bastogne, near the town of Malmedy. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, approximately 140 men, was moving to new positions when they encountered the spearhead of Kampfgruppe Piper, the lead element of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Outgunned and outnumbered, the Americans quickly surrendered. The prisoners were herded into a field. Then, without warning, German troops opened fire with machine guns and pistols. 84 American prisoners of war were murdered in cold blood. Some wounded survivors played dead in the snow. Others attempted to escape and were hunted down. Private First Class Michael Sharanko survived by playing dead. I fell when the shooting started. Bodies fell on top of me. I could hear the Germans walking among us, firing shots into anyone who moved or made a sound. I lay there for hours in the freezing snow, covered in blood, not daring to move. When I finally crawled away after dark, I looked back and saw the field full of bodies in the snow. News of the Malmedy massacre spread quickly through American lines. The effect on American soldiers was immediate and profound. The battle took on a harder, more bitter edge. Quarters that might have been offered before were no longer extended. The knowledge that surrender might mean execution stiffened American resolve everywhere. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding the Kampfgruppe, denied ordering the massacre, but the atrocity would forever be associated with his name. His advance, which had initially made good progress, began to slow as American resistance stiffened and as his unit consumed its limited fuel supplies. For the American soldiers in the Ardennes, the Germans were not the only enemy. The weather was equally deadly. The winter of 1944-1945 was one of the coldest on record in Europe. Temperatures regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow fell almost constantly. The dense cloud cover meant that Allied air superiority, normally overwhelming, was completely negated. For infantry soldiers living in foxholes, the cold was a constant, life-threatening danger. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, became epidemic. Frostbite claimed hundreds of casualties. Simply staying alive in these conditions required constant effort. Sergeant John McKinley of the 26th Infantry Division described the daily struggle. You couldn't get warm, ever. We'd huddle in our foxholes trying to share body heat. We'd exercise our fingers and toes constantly to keep circulation going. Guys would take turns getting out of the foxhole and running in place just to get blood flowing. We knew if we fell asleep in those conditions, we might not wake up. The cold affected equipment as critically as it affected men. Weapons froze. Tank engines wouldn't start. Vehicles slid off icy roads. Radio batteries died in the cold. The M1 Garand rifle, normally reliable, would freeze if not constantly maintained. Machine guns required special attention to keep functioning. Food, when it arrived, was often frozen solid. Water in canteens froze. Men learned to keep their canteens inside their clothing, using body heat to prevent freezing. Hot food and coffee, when they could be obtained, were treasured beyond measure. Medical treatment in these conditions was particularly challenging. Captain John McAdam, a battalion surgeon with the 23rd Infantry Regiment, recalled, "We were treating wounded in barns, in churches, in any shelter we could find, but even indoors, temperatures were below freezing. Plasma would freeze before we could administer it. We'd have to warm it against our bodies. Bandages would freeze to wounds. Morphine syrettes were carried in medics' mouths to keep them from freezing. The cold killed men that we could have saved in better conditions. But the same weather that tortured American soldiers also hindered German operations. The dense clouds that prevented Allied air support also prevented German air reconnaissance. The snow and mud slowed German advances. Tanks bogged down. Supply vehicles couldn't reach forward units. The weather, brutal as it was, affected both sides. While defenders at Bastogne, St. Vith, and countless other positions fought to hold against German advances, the Allied High Command was organizing a counteroffensive. On December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower met with his senior commanders at Verdun to plan the Allied response. Present at this meeting was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the Third Army, which had been advancing toward the Sarre region in eastern France. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could disengage from his current offensive, pivot his entire army 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge. Patton's response shocked everyone in the room. On December 22nd, with 3 divisions, moving an entire army consisting of hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and all their supplies, 90 degrees in 3 days was considered impossible. But Patton had already anticipated the request and had his staff working on movement plans. True to his word, on December 22nd, Patton's Third Army launched its counteroffensive from the south. The 4th Armored Division led the attack, fighting through snow, ice, and fierce German resistance, driving toward Bastogne to relieve the surrounded garrison. The advance was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Every village, every crossroads, every hill had to be fought for. German forces, knowing that Bastogne's relief would doom their offensive, fought desperately to stop Patton's advance. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led the spearhead toward Bastogne. His tankers fought through ambushes, battled German tanks at close range, and pressed forward regardless of casualties. Abrams would later become Army Chief of Staff, but in December 1944 he was a tank commander leading from the front. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The defenders, who had endured a week of hell, were relieved. The German offensive, already stalling, had lost one of its key objectives. Captain William Dwight of the 4th Armored Division described entering Bastogne. The paratroopers looked like ghosts, filthy, exhausted, half-frozen. But when they saw our tanks coming up the road, they started cheering. Some were crying. We'd brought ammunition, medical supplies, food. But more than that, we'd proven that they hadn't been forgotten, that we would fight through anything to reach them. On December 23rd, a miracle occurred. The weather cleared. For the first time in a week, Allied aircraft could fly. The result was catastrophic for German forces. Thousands of Allied aircraft took to the skies. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons, and medium bombers swarmed over the battlefield. German columns caught in the open were devastated. Supply convoys were destroyed. Tank concentrations were attacked relentlessly. The German advance, already slowing, ground to a halt. For American soldiers who had fought under the clouds for a week, the appearance of Allied aircraft was emotional. Sergeant Frank Towers of the 2nd Armored Division recalled, "We heard the engines first. Then we saw them. Hundreds of planes. More planes than I'd ever seen at once. The sky was full of them. We started cheering, crying, jumping up and down. We knew then that we were going to win this thing." The air attacks were supplemented by massive supply drops to surrounded or isolated American units. C-47 transports, flying through German anti-aircraft fire, dropped supplies to Bastogne and other besieged positions. Colored parachutes carrying ammunition, food, and medical supplies drifted down while fighter aircraft strafed German positions. Meanwhile, German forces were running out of fuel. The offensive had been planned on the assumption that German forces would capture Allied fuel dumps as they advanced. But American defenders, even when retreating, had managed to destroy or evacuate most fuel stocks. German tanks, particularly the fuel-hungry Panthers and Tigers, were literally running dry. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had advanced deepest into American lines, reaching Stoumont, found itself out of fuel and surrounded. On December 24th, Peiper ordered his remaining vehicles destroyed and led his men in a fighting retreat back to German lines, abandoning his wounded to American care. By Christmas Day, it was clear that the German offensive had failed. They had not reached the Meuse River. They had not captured Antwerp. They had not split the Allied armies. What they had done was spend their last mobile reserves in a gamble that had failed. With the German offensive stopped, Allied forces began the slow, brutal work of pushing German forces back and eliminating the Bulge. This would take until the end of January 1945 and would cost thousands more casualties. The counteroffensive involved forces attacking from north and south to pinch off the Bulge. Montgomery's 21st Army Group attacked from the north, while Patton's 3rd Army continued pushing from the south. In the center, American units that had been defending now went over to the attack. The fighting in January 1945 was, if anything, more brutal than the December fighting. German forces, while retreating, fought tenacious rearguard actions. They knew they were falling back into Germany itself, and every yard of Belgian soil they held was one less yard the Allies could advance toward the Reich. Weather continued to be atrocious. Soldiers fought through blizzards, trudged through snow that often reached their knees, and endured cold that seemed to penetrate to their bones. Villages changed hands multiple times, each time costing lives on both sides. Private First Class Lester Atwell, an infantryman with the 5th Infantry Division, described the January fighting. "We'd take a village in the morning and the Germans would counterattack in the afternoon. We'd fight house to house, room to room. The snow in the streets would turn pink with blood. At night, we'd hear the wounded crying in the darkness, German and American both, and there wasn't much we could do for either. Slowly, inexorably, Allied forces ground forward. By mid-January, the Bulge had been reduced significantly. By the end of January, the front line was essentially back to where it had been on December 16th. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The price of victory in the Ardennes was staggering. American forces suffered approximately 89,000 casualties, 19,000 killed, 7,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. This made it the bloodiest battle for American forces in World War II. The 106th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of the initial German assault, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, losing 2/3 of its strength. The division would be rebuilt, but the psychological scars of the Schnee-Eifel surrender would haunt survivors for decades. Individual units suffered appalling casualties. Some rifle companies were reduced to just a handful of survivors. The 110th Infantry Regiment of the 28th Division, which held the center of the line and bore the full weight of Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, was virtually annihilated. Of the regiment's approximately 3,000 men, over 2,500 were casualties. Tank losses were equally severe. American forces lost over 700 tanks and tank destroyers. Hundreds of vehicles of all types were destroyed or abandoned. Artillery pieces, mortars, and crew-served weapons were lost by the hundreds. But German losses were even more catastrophic, and for Germany at this stage of the war, irreplaceable. German forces suffered between 80,000 and 100,000 casualties. More critically, they lost between 600 and 800 tanks and assault guns, representing the last mobile reserves of the German army. These could not be replaced. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,000 aircraft in supporting the offensive, losses that gutted the remaining German air capability. Perhaps most importantly, the Germans had consumed their last stocks of fuel and ammunition in the offensive. The failure of the Ardennes offensive meant that Germany had no capacity to conduct another strategic offensive anywhere. From this point forward, Germany could only defend, and with ever-diminishing resources. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last gamble and last gasp in the West. The failure of the offensive meant that the war would end with Germany's unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiated settlement, no separate peace with the Western Allies. For the American soldiers who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the battle became a defining experience. Veterans spoke of the Bulge in terms usually reserved for the most traumatic experiences, a test of endurance, courage, and will that left permanent marks on those who survived. The battle proved several things about the American soldier and the American army. First, even green, untested units could fight with determination and courage when circumstances demanded it. The 99th Division, in its first combat, stopped elite SS Panzer divisions. The 106th Division, overrun and destroyed, still delayed the German advance by days through its resistance. Second, the battle demonstrated the importance of junior leadership. With communications disrupted, higher headquarters out of contact, and the situation chaotic, squad leaders, platoon leaders, and company commanders made decisions that affected the entire battle's outcome. Men like the squad leaders at Elsenborn Ridge who refused to abandon their positions, like the tank destroyer crews who fought to the last round, like the paratroopers at Bastogne who held against all odds. Third, the battle showed the resilience of American logistics and the American industrial base. Losses that would have crippled the German army were replaced within days. Divisions that had been mauled were reconstituted with replacement soldiers flowing from training camps in the United States. Equipment destroyed was replaced from stockpiles that seemed inexhaustible. The Battle of the Bulge also cemented certain reputations and created legends. General McAuliffe and his nuts response became American folklore. The 101st Airborne Division's stand at Bastogne became the stuff of legend. Patton's rapid pivot and relief of Bastogne enhanced his reputation as America's most aggressive commander. For German forces, the Ardennes offensive was the death knell. The failure meant that when Allied armies resumed their advance in February 1945, German forces had neither the men, equipment, nor fuel to conduct an effective defense. The road to Berlin was open, though it would still require 3 more months of hard fighting to reach it. Perhaps the best way to understand what American soldiers endured in the Ardennes is through their own words, recorded in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. Private First Class Kurt Gable, 17th Airborne Division, writing in his diary. December 27th. We've been fighting for 3 days straight. I can't remember the last time I was warm. 2 men in my squad are dead, 3 more wounded and evacuated. We keep fighting because there's nothing else to do. The Germans are in front of us, we can't go back. So we go forward, one frozen step at a time. Sergeant Bill True, 101st Airborne Division, in a letter written after Bastogne's relief. Ma, I can't tell you where we've been or what we've done, but I can tell you that I've seen things that will stay with me forever. I've seen men do things I didn't think humans were capable of, both terrible and heroic. I've seen friends die. I've wondered if I would survive the next minute. But we held. We did what we were asked to do. When you read about Bastogne someday, know that I was there and that we didn't let them down. Captain Roland Winter, 422nd Infantry Regiment, captured at the Schnee Eifel in a post-war interview. The surrender was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. We'd fought for 3 days with no food, low ammunition, completely surrounded. When the order came to surrender, I felt like I'd failed. It took me years to understand that we hadn't failed. We'd held for 3 days against overwhelming odds. We'd bought time that allowed other units to form a defense. Our sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice, mattered. These voices, and thousands more like them, tell the real story of the Battle of the Bulge. Not a story of brilliant generals and sweeping maneuvers, though those elements were present, but a story of ordinary soldiers, many of them teenage draftees, thrust into extraordinary circumstances and finding within themselves reserves of courage, endurance, and determination they hadn't known they possessed. The Battle of the Bulge was won not by superior tactics or brilliant strategy, though those played their parts. It was won by the determination of American soldiers who refused to quit even when surrounded, outnumbered, frozen, and seemingly defeated. It was won by the medics who treated wounded in frozen barns, often under fire, sometimes with bare hands because their gloves prevented delicate work. It was won by the artillerymen who kept firing even when their positions were being overrun. It was won by the tank destroyer crews who engaged German armor at point-blank range, knowing their lighter vehicles were outmatched but fighting anyway. It was won by the soldiers who shared their last rations with wounded comrades, by the men who gave up their blankets to cover the wounded, by the squad that held a crossroads for an extra hour even though it meant none of them survived, by the medic who went into no man's land in darkness to retrieve wounded, ignoring the risk. The frozen hell of the Ardennes tested American soldiers to their limits and beyond. Many died. Many more were wounded, physically and psychologically. But they survived, they held, and ultimately they won. When the battle ended in late January 1945, the soldiers who had survived were changed. They had endured cold beyond imagination, fear beyond description, and losses beyond acceptance. But they had also discovered something about themselves, that when everything is stripped away, when you're cold, hungry, frightened, and faced with an enemy that seems unstoppable, the human spirit has reserves of strength that can overcome any adversity. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to fight despite being terrified. It's holding your position when every instinct screams to run. It's protecting your fellow soldiers even when protecting yourself seems impossible. While the broad strokes of the Battle of the Bulge are well documented, the battle was really thousands of individual actions, small unit fights that collectively determined the outcome. Each crossroads, each village, each hill had its own desperate story. The defense of Lanzerath. On the first day of the offensive, December 16th, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men from the 99th Infantry Division, commanded by First Lieutenant Lyle Book, Jr., held a position at Lanzerath, a small village on a critical road junction. Their mission was to observe and report German movements. What they observed was terrifying. An entire German parachute division, over 5,000 men, advancing directly toward their position. Bach radioed for artillery support and permission to withdraw. Both requests were denied. He was ordered to hold his position. For an entire day, these 18 men fought off attacks by hundreds of German paratroopers. They called artillery fire so close to their own position that dirt from the explosions showered down on them. They fired their weapons until the barrels glowed red hot. When their machine guns ran out of ammunition, they used rifles. When rifles ran low, they threw grenades. Private First Class William James Tsakanicus, one of the platoon's soldiers, later recalled, "We knew we were dead men. There was no way 18 of us could hold against thousands. But Lieutenant Book said we had our orders and we'd follow them. So we did. We fought until our ammunition was gone, until we couldn't fight anymore." The platoon held for an entire day, December 16th, delaying the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Division's route by critical hours. By the time they were finally overwhelmed and captured late that afternoon, the delay had disrupted German timetables. The 18 men had inflicted an estimated 400-500 German casualties. Every member of the platoon earned the Silver Star, though the awards weren't processed until decades after the war due to the chaos of the battle. Lieutenant Book and his men spent the rest of the war as prisoners, but their stand at Lanzerath was exactly the kind of small-unit heroism that, multiplied across the entire front, defeated the German offensive. The engineers at Malmedy. While the massacre near Malmedy receives most attention, less known is the desperate defense of Malmedy itself by American engineers. Company C, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, was in Malmedy when news of approaching German spearheads reached them on December 17th. Engineers were not infantry. They were trained to build bridges, clear mines, and construct fortifications, not to engage in sustained combat. But Lieutenant Thomas Stack, commanding the company, organized a defense of the town using his engineers as infantry. With only their personal weapons, a few machine guns, and determination, these engineers held Malmedy against repeated attacks by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. They set up roadblocks using their construction equipment, laid hasty minefields, and engaged German tanks with bazookas at point-blank range. Sergeant Charles Hensel, a squad leader in the company, described the fighting. "We weren't trained for this. We were engineers, not infantrymen. But Germans were coming and someone had to stop them. So we stopped them. We used everything we had, our rifles, our explosives, our knowledge of demolitions. We blew bridges, cratered roads, made them pay for every yard." The engineers held Malmedy for the entire battle. The town never fell, denying German forces a critical road junction and forcing them to use less suitable routes. Company C suffered 50% casualties, but accomplished their mission. It was another example of American soldiers doing whatever was necessary, regardless of their job description or training. The armor fight at Chelles. As German spearheads drove west, one Kampfgruppe of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the village of Chelles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River, the deepest German penetration of the entire offensive. This was as close as German forces would get to their objective. And it was here that they met their doom. On December 24th and 25th, the 2nd Panzer Division's lead elements, including approximately 80 tanks and assault guns, were caught by American forces converging from multiple directions. The 2nd Armored Division, attacking from the north, and elements of the British 29th Armored Brigade blocked further advance. The German forces, out of fuel and low on ammunition, were trapped. What followed was less a battle than an execution. American and British tanks, with infantry support and complete air superiority, systematically destroyed the German force. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commanding an M4 Sherman tank from the 3rd Armored Division, participated in the engagement. He later described it. "They were sitting ducks. Out of fuel, couldn't maneuver. We'd spot a panther or tiger, maneuver to where we could get a side shot and knock it out. It was almost unfair, but I remembered all the times they'd had the advantage over us. This was payback." By December 26th, the 2nd Panzer Division had been destroyed as an effective force. Over 80 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or captured. Hundreds of German soldiers were killed or captured. The tip of the German spear had been broken off. No German forces would get closer to the Meuse than Keller's. While the fighting at the front was desperate, the German offensive also created panic and chaos in rear areas. German commandos, operating under the command of SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, infiltrated American lines wearing American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles. This operation, known as Operation Greif, was intended to seize bridges over the Meuse River and create confusion. While it failed in its primary objectives, it succeeded in creating paranoia throughout the American rear area. Roadblocks were set up everywhere to catch infiltrators. American soldiers were asked obscure questions about American culture, sports, and geography to prove they were really American. General Omar Bradley, the 12th Army Group commander, was temporarily detained at a roadblock when he couldn't answer a question about the Illinois state capitol correctly. Rumors spread wildly. Reports claimed that German assassins were targeting Eisenhower. Security around Allied headquarters became intense. Every German-speaking prisoner was suspected of being a commando. Every unexplained incident was attributed to infiltrators. Private First Class George Koskimaki, 101st Airborne Division, recalled the atmosphere. "Nobody trusted anyone. You'd meet guys from your own unit and have to prove who you were. The passwords changed constantly. There were rumors that Germans had poisoned wells, that paratroopers were landing behind our lines, that entire German battalions were operating in American uniforms. Most of it was nonsense, but in the chaos, you didn't know what to believe." In reality, Operation Greif was a limited success at best. Most of the German commandos were captured or killed within days. Several were executed as spies for fighting in enemy uniforms, a violation of the laws of war. But the psychological impact lingered, adding to the stress and confusion of the battle. Unlike World War I, where an unofficial Christmas truce occurred in 1914, there was no truce in the Ardennes during Christmas 1944. The fighting continued without pause, perhaps even intensifying as both sides recognized the battle's critical nature. For American soldiers, Christmas 1944 was one of the most miserable of their lives. Far from home, engaged in desperate combat, freezing in foxholes, with little prospect of hot food or rest, the holiday was just another day of survival. Some units received special Christmas rations, turkey and fruitcake when logistics permitted. Many did not. Some received Christmas cards and packages from home, though mail delivery was sporadic at best during the battle. Chaplains held services when circumstances allowed, sometimes in shell-damaged churches, sometimes in snowy fields. Chaplain James O'Neill, chaplain of the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, held Christmas services in a damaged church in the town. He later wrote, "The church had been hit by shells. Windows were blown out. It was freezing inside. But the men came, those who could be spared from the perimeter. We sang Christmas carols, and some of the men wept, not from fear, but from the aching distance from home, from normal life, from everything Christmas should be." For many soldiers, Christmas 1944 was marked not by joy, but by grim determination. They fought on Christmas Day as they had fought the day before and would fight the day after. The war respected no holidays. Sergeant Frank Danius, 2nd Infantry Division, wrote in his diary on Christmas Day 1944, "Christmas in Belgium, some Christmas. We're supposed to attack this morning. At least we got hot coffee. That's something. I try not to think about home, about what my family is doing. It hurts too much. Better to focus on what's in front of me. The next hill, the next town, staying alive until tomorrow. While the heroism of frontline soldiers captured headlines, the Battle of the Bulge was also won by the unglamorous work of logistics personnel who kept American forces supplied under nightmarish conditions. The sudden German offensive disrupted supply lines and threatened supply dumps. Quartermaster and ordnance units had to evacuate massive stockpiles of fuel, ammunition, and supplies ahead of German advances, while simultaneously maintaining supply to units engaged in heavy combat. The road network in the Ardennes was limited, and what roads existed were clogged with traffic moving in both directions, reinforcements and supplies moving forward, wounded and refugees moving back. Military police worked around the clock to maintain traffic flow, often under fire. The delivery of supplies to surrounded Bastogne by air, once weather cleared, was a particular feat. C-47 transport aircraft flew through German anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies. Of the 1,000 tons of supplies dropped to Bastogne between December 23rd and 26th, approximately 95% was recovered by American forces, an extraordinary percentage for airdrops. Lieutenant Colonel Hal McCown, operations officer for the 30th Infantry Division, later said, "People focus on the combat, and rightly so. But this battle was also won by the clerks who kept track of supplies, the truck drivers who drove through the night on icy roads under threat of ambush, the cooks who somehow produced hot food under impossible conditions. War is 90% logistics, and in the Bulge, our logistics were better than theirs. That's why we won." By early January 1945, German forces were in full retreat. What had been their last offensive had become a desperate defensive action to prevent the entire force in the Bulge from being encircled and destroyed. American and British forces attacked from north and south, aiming to meet in the middle and trap German forces. The weather remained brutal, but Allied forces pressed forward relentlessly. Villages that Germans had captured in December were retaken in January, often at significant cost as German rearguards fought stubbornly. The fighting in January was grinding, exhausting work. Units that had been defending for 3 weeks now had to attack. Soldiers who had held frozen foxholes now had to advance through deep snow, clearing villages and destroying German positions. Private First Class Paul Fussell, an infantry platoon leader with the 103rd Infantry Division, described the January fighting. "It was like wading through cold molasses. Every step was an effort. The Germans contested every position. You'd take a village in the morning, and they'd counterattack in the afternoon. The only thing that kept us going was knowing that we were winning, that with every yard we advanced, we were closer to ending this war." By January 16th, the First Army attacking from the north and Patton's Third Army attacking from the south met at Houffalize, a small Belgian town that marked roughly the center of the Bulge. The pocket was eliminated. German forces that hadn't retreated were trapped and destroyed or forced to surrender. By January 28th, the front line was essentially back to where it had been on December 16th. The Battle of the Bulge was over. 6 weeks of brutal fighting had eliminated the German salient, but returned the front to its starting position. The cost had been enormous on both sides. While casualty figures typically count killed, wounded, and missing, they don't capture the psychological casualties of the Battle of the Bulge. Combat exhaustion, what we now call PTSD, affected thousands of American soldiers. The intensity and duration of combat in the Ardennes, combined with the brutal weather and the shock of the initial German assault, pushed many soldiers beyond their psychological limits. Division psychiatrists saw floods of cases, men who couldn't stop shaking, who couldn't sleep, who became catatonic or broke down sobbing. Captain Frederick Hansen, a division psychiatrist with the 9th Infantry Division, later wrote, "We saw cases of complete psychological breakdown. Men who had functioned normally for months suddenly couldn't function at all. The combination of fear, cold, exhaustion, and loss was too much. Some recovered with rest. Others didn't recover for years, if ever." The Army's understanding of combat stress was limited in 1944. Many soldiers suffering from psychological trauma were told to snap out of it or accused of cowardice. Others were given minimal rest and sent back to their units. Some were court-martialed for refusing to fight or for desertion when they were actually suffering from severe psychological trauma. The long-term effects of the Battle of the Bulge haunted many veterans for the rest of their lives. Nightmares, survivor's guilt, difficulty adjusting to civilian life, and what we now recognize as PTSD affected thousands. Many suffered in silence, ashamed to admit their psychological wounds in an era that stigmatized mental health issues. For German forces, the Battle of the Bulge represented the final expenditure of their strategic reserves for no meaningful gain. German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes recognized this. Many veterans later admitted that while they fought hard and achieved initial success, they knew the offensive couldn't succeed. The resources simply weren't there to reach Antwerp, let alone hold it. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division in the offensive, later said, "We knew it was hopeless. We didn't have the fuel to reach the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. We didn't have the air cover to protect our advance. We didn't have the reserves to exploit any breakthrough. But we were soldiers, we had our orders, and we fought. Many good men died for a plan that couldn't work." The failure of the Ardennes offensive meant that Germany had no strategic options remaining. All reserves had been committed and lost. The Wehrmacht could only conduct defensive operations with ever-diminishing resources. The end was now inevitable, just a matter of time. For individual German soldiers, the battle was often a traumatic experience. Many were young men, some barely 18, thrown into combat with minimal training. They fought bravely but were overwhelmed by Allied firepower and resources. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, a young German soldier captured during the battle, told his interrogators, "We were told we would win, that secret weapons would save Germany. But when we saw the American supplies, their equipment, their endless columns of trucks and tanks, we knew we couldn't win. You can't defeat an enemy that has everything in unlimited quantities. We had courage, but you had everything else." The Battle of the Bulge taught the U.S. Army numerous lessons, many of which influenced post-war military doctrine. The failure to detect German offensive preparations was a massive intelligence failure. Post-war analysis led to better integration of intelligence sources and more emphasis on challenging assumptions. The Battle of the Bulge showed the importance of mobile reserves. The rapid commitment of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to plug the breach was crucial. Post-war doctrine emphasized maintaining strategic reserves. The battle demonstrated that in chaotic, fluid situations, junior officers and NCOs must be able to make decisions independently. Training emphasis shifted to developing leadership at all levels. The ability to rapidly shift supplies and units proved decisive. The American military's emphasis on logistics as a key component of combat power was reinforced. The battle showed the effectiveness of combined arms operations, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together. This became a cornerstone of post-war doctrine. The difference in performance between veteran units and green units was stark. This emphasized the need for thorough training before commitment to combat. Statistics tell us that 19,000 American soldiers died in the Battle of the Bulge, but behind each number was a person, a son, brother, husband, father. Each death rippled across families and communities. Private First Class Henry Tannenbaum, killed near Bastogne on December 24, 1944, was 19 years old. He had been drafted 6 months earlier, trained, shipped overseas, and thrust into combat. His parents received a telegram on January 3, 1945. His body came home in 1948. Sergeant Michael O'Grady, killed at St. Vith on December 21st, left behind a wife and 2-month-old daughter he had never seen. His daughter grew up with only photographs and stories. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, killed leading his platoon near Malmedy on December 18th, had been writing a letter to his parents when the attack came. The unfinished letter was returned to them with his personal effects. These were not statistics. They were real people whose lives were cut short, whose futures were stolen, whose families grieved for decades. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge extended far beyond the frozen forests of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last attempt to change the war's outcome in the West. It failed, but it cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides and inflicted untold suffering on soldiers and civilians caught in the fighting. For American soldiers, the battle became a defining moment, a test of endurance and courage that many would speak of for the rest of their lives. They had faced seemingly impossible odds, endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, and prevailed through determination, sacrifice, and the support of their fellow soldiers. The frozen hell of the Ardennes showed what American soldiers could endure and accomplish when pushed to their limits. It demonstrated that training, equipment, and logistics matter, but that ultimately battles are won by soldiers who refuse to quit. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge endures. The American cemeteries in Belgium, where thousands of white crosses mark the graves of soldiers who died in the battle, remain sites of pilgrimage. The Belgian people, liberated twice in 6 weeks, maintain their gratitude. Towns like Bastogne host annual commemorations. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge, now all in their late 90s or passed away, carried the memories of those 6 weeks for their entire lives. Many struggled to speak of their experiences, the trauma too deep, the losses too painful. Others felt a duty to remember and to educate, to ensure that the sacrifices made in the frozen forests were not forgotten. The Battle of the Bulge was not the largest battle of World War II, nor the longest, nor the deadliest. But for the American soldiers who fought there, it was all of those things. It was their test, their trial by fire and ice, their moment when they stood against darkness and prevailed. They survived the frozen hell, and in doing so, they demonstrated that freedom is never free, that it must be defended by those willing to endure any hardship, face any danger, and make any sacrifice to preserve it. The soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge gave us that gift. We owe them our eternal gratitude and our solemn promise to remember their sacrifice. Not just as statistics or history, but as individual human beings who stood in the frozen forests of Belgium in December 1944 and refused to surrender, refused to quit, and refused to fail. They are the heroes of the Battle of the Bulge, and their story deserves to be told and remembered for as long as freedom endures.